Okay. Did you hear me? Okay. Sorry, it seems that the machine heard me and decided to complot against me. So, around 1690, John Locke wrote that there might be other species of creatures in other parts of the universe, better intellectual beings than man, with faculties more or perfecter than we have to penetrate into the nature and inmost constitutions of things. What ideas they may receive of them far different from us, we know not. We know and certainly find that we want several other views of them besides those we have to make discoveries of them more perfect. He might look like be writing about posthumans, but he was indeed writing about angels, and to put things worse, I don't think there is any difference. By the 1617s, few people in England ignored the existence of pig-faced humans. Miss Tanakin Skinker, the most popular of them, deserved many pamphlets and songs. Although pamphlets attributed her shape to witchcraft, the scientists of the Royal Society of London searched for rational explanations for this phenomenon. They quoted contemporary authorities, such as the friend of Galileo and famous physician Fortunio Lichetti's work on monsters, which reported a hybrid with a hog body and a human head, or the French royal surgeon's description of a similar case in Brussels. Hybrids were interesting to clarify questions about generation in animals, and the Royal Society's article defended that the pigman was not a hybrid produced through an interspecies intercourse, but a malformed pig. The prestigious physician who wrote the article, John Floyer, argued that this was a conclusion from experimental observation. But there are many ways of explaining these facts, and his narrative shows his concerns and assumptions that there was a clear line dividing species. There were men and there were pigs. Floyer College from Oxford, the philosopher John Locke, also became interested in these cases of hybridization. He was as well a fellow of the Royal Society and an eminent physician, but unlike Floyer, inventor of the pulsometer, or his French colleague reputed as the father of surgery, Locke's medical abilities were obscured by his fame as the father of cognitive psychology and liberalism, among other Western freak offsprings. Locke read the same books and heard similar stories than Floyer, but for him, I quote him, "The boundaries of that species are so far from being determined." He wondered in his essay who would undertake to resolve what species that monster was of which is mentioned by Lichetus, with a man's head and a hog's body. If any of these creatures had lived and could have spoke, it would have increased the difficulty. Had the upper part to the middle been of human shape and all below swine, had it been murdered to destroy it? I quote again, "There are creatures that, with language and reason and shape in other things agreeing with ours, have hairy tails, others where the males have no birds, and others where the females have." Despite this conclusion, he declared that it was reason what distinguished man from beast, and thus gave him dominion over them and the rest of the world. Locke had to establish a clear dividing line between man and beast to defend and expand property of the privileged like him, slightly modifying a well-established tradition. Sorry. Early modern justice and law explain in Europe that the world was divided first between civilization and barbarism, and second between people, things, and actions. The universal rules valid for both civilization and wilderness were known as natural law and consisted in 3 rules: to give each one his due, not to bound another, and to live honestly. What was due to each one was called sum, and the person hard in his sum could defend himself by his own hand if there was no society to defend him. Sum made the person. It was his property, and it consisted of life, limbs, liberties, reputation, honor, and actions. The person's own actions, translated as labor, allowed him to transform nature for his use, by instance, picking up an acorn to eat. He was transmuting natural things into his personhood. The person mixed his actions, labor or industry, with nature, transforming it, incorporating it to his person, appropriating it, acquiring dominion over it, either gathering an acorn, cultivating the earth, or writing a paper. And through this process, he acquired an expanded self. The person was a composed thing that possessed itself, and this self-ownership allowed it to incorporate nature to become part of it. Man, through his actions, appropriated not only things, such as acorns, by gathering them as food. He could also recollect memories of actions. Through this work of remembering, actions were appropriated to constitute this man's conscience, building his identity and personhood. In case somebody would take the acorn from the man's mouth, being part of himself like his limb by them, he could recall his labor of gathering the acorn to claim it, because he was conscious of the act of incorporating the acorn into himself. Actions, wrote Locke, were appropriated to me now by this self-consciousness. Conscience appropriated the actions, and through thinking, the actions were joined to constitute a person, its identity. Man was a corporeal, rational being, a composed thing with a changing body, with conscience and reason, and for this, he was an owner of itself and of the things that were becoming him through his actions. And it was both then responsible and punishable before the law. This was the abstract Lockean notion of man and personhood. The abstract personhood inhabited a fiction called the state of nature, useful to explain how a narrow elite increased its personality so much from the original state of communality and could still appropriate more than others in wild places in the state of nature, such as the Americas, according to Locke. He legitimized his society distribution of wealth and rights. Thus, the natural man served to explain what concerned him most, man as a part of a distributed body, a body politic. For Locke, the rules applied to people in the state of nature were applied as well among states. As there were diverse status in body parts, the head at the top of the hierarchy, there were classes within the body politic of the state. And as there were classes among humans, there were also hierarchies among states. For Locke, every difference depended on rationality, conscience, and labor. According to him, God made men potentially rational and free in order to understand and follow the divine law of nature, commanding to understand and improve nature for the sake of mankind. The way of improving nature was through commerce. Nature was transformed through labor, gaining value, but it was only materialized in a commercial market, exchanged for non-perishable money that could be unlimitedly stored with no expiry date. To realize about this biblical, natural, and scientific fact, and fulfill God's wishes, man had to develop his reason, maintaining conscience free from superstition. To avoid any superstition, the best was to follow rational religion. The Royal Society's interpretation of Christianity is called latitudinarianism or latitudinism. Once man was conscious of God's will, he needed freedom to develop commerce. That is, a state guaranteeing contractually that he had his sum, his properties, protected without the need of defending himself. This freedom was the only really possible through a parliamentary system. This was the peak of civilization. At the other extreme, it was the wilderness, nature, which not being labored or having been under-labored remained commons of mankind to be appropriated by the country that could improve them most. For Locke and his colleagues, America was the wilderness and should be appropriated by sovereign commercial civilized nations. Civilized labor didn't involve their acquisition of property unless granted by their sovereign, the head of the body politic. It was the mystical body of civilized nations who could appropriate America, transforming it through industrial labor, adding value to it. The earth transformed through the labor of civilized subjects, and this might be the slave owner through the work of his slave, was commoditized for the commercial system, increasing its value through circulation. Locke's argument contains the Enlightenment's 4 stages theory of human society's civilization progress: hunting, gathering, shepherding, agriculture, and commerce, and entails a distribution of the earth according to various degrees of improvement, civilization, and reason. According to Locke, the world was for the industrious and rational, but the industrious and rational was not an individual. He was a noble subject of a civilized nation. Labor, reason, and conscience created personality, a possessive and expansive conception of humans and what interact with them. And I would dare to say that is basically, theoretically, unchallenged despite its colonial background. So commerce created a sociability proper of civilized nation, opposite to barbaric and violent practices. It improved manners, promoting a polite society, polishing passions through gentle conversation. It favored the arts and sciences, and these polished passions promoted freedom and supported commerce. This polite culture legitimized expansion of both a ruling class and also an empire. Societies progressed from the apolitical state of nature to the most civilized free nations ruled by a non-arbitrary parliamentary government guaranteeing liberties, that is, properties and rights to them, allowing the rich subjects to devote to commerce and industry, increasing the value of the world through the monetary exchange system, legitimizing its expansion. Thus, Locke's corporeal rational being had consciousness, a body in expansion, sometimes conceived as isolated, sometimes forming bigger bodies, such as the body politic, and it had reason. Reason was a faculty composed by sagacity and inference, and consisted on awareness, the sensorial perception of things, collection of information, and from this, the deduction of universal ideas, discovering and ordering the connections between them with certainty or probability. Perception depended upon observation, sensing of things, and of their social classification. The perception of reason consisted in elucidate whether a corporeal being was making general signs from particular experiences, and were deployed by men but not by beasts. Reason was the ability of abstracting, of eliminating the context from the particulars, of modifying perception, adapting it to a social context, and simplifying it to communicate them. Thus, the use of reason as to become a man or a person meant, first, to perform and understand general science, involving a deduction from both personal and social experiences, and second, to remember own actions, gathering own memories, showing to be in possession of himself. Locke's corporeal rational being, or moral man, makes us imagine a rich, white Western male. But Locke argued that any corporeal being, whatever its shape, might be a man depending on its performance on rationality. Children, idiots, and even more illiterate people and savages, I'm quoting him, might be considered rational because they perform general science. The recognition of these abstractions would be a matter of objective knowledge. But as there were degrees of civilization, there were degrees of civility and rationality, and they depended on education. Are general science different from social performances through movements that can be read by a trained audience? Indeed, Locke's society recognized corporeal rational beings through their movements and science because there was a well-established tradition of physiognomy. These signs and movements could be decodified by an audience not only aware of social practices, but trained through physiognomic treatises widely read even in front of a mirror as a way of self-knowledge and to improve conduct. Physiognomy consisted on knowing people's character from the visual and sonic perception of their complexion, movements, and gestures. The founding institution of the scientific revolution, the Real Society, gave much credit to this discipline. And Locke himself was used to read universal signs and emotions in faces, movements, and gestures. He recommended gentlemen to read La Bruyère Characters, a bestseller physiognomic treatise for learning conduct, because it treated, I quote, of the passions and how they are moved. The gentleman had to learn choreographing movements and gestures to look like the well-born man he claimed to be. Physiognomy borrowed materials from medicine and rhetoric, and Locke recommended the gentleman to read as well books of rhetoric by Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian to develop perspicuity, using proper terms for the ideas or thoughts which he would have passed from his own mind into that of another man. And it could be obtained by reading books written with the greatest clearness and propriety. Rhetorical propriety covered from correct diction to decorous behavior. Locke used recurrently properly, and propriety. The word propriety had both legal and rhetorical meanings. It was a synonym of property, what was proprium sum, one's own, including things and actions leading to appropriate things. But it was also a natural quality of knowing what was appropriate, inclination or disposition of fitting well, suitable, and it was related to beauty, manners, and virtue. During the 17th century, there was no distinction between the words property and propriety, and Locke frequently exchanged them. An owner was a proprietor of properties and proprieties, and he appropriated them in an appropriated way. Locke demanded reason, both perspicuity and propriety, to perceive and appropriate perceptions and to learn how to deliver them to convince the audience and make it virtuous. There was an ethical appropriateness in imitating good speech and decorous manners, and also in deploying clarity in words and diction. There is a connection between appropriateness, propriety, reason, conscience, decency, identity, and self-ownership of a man. A corporeal being's right reason appropriated perception, created abstraction from them, and also appropriated his past actions, creating his conscience and identity, becoming the owner of himself and all his extensions. This allowed him to recognize how to transmit these abstractions, how to behave and speak propriety, before the audience through a suitable performance with propriety transmitting virtue. Reason, intelligence, consciousness, identity, and the ways of measuring them are cultural performances. When Locke argued if a whole man had spoke, it would have increased the difficulty of classifying it, or when Wittgenstein said, if a lion could talk, we could not understand him, they were both sharing that there was a mankind with a single communicational system and a specific way of reasoning. This is promising in a way. There might be diverse ways of perceiving and reasoning in the world that we might not share or understand. And it is dangerous in another way, identifying a universal human nature independent of any context, movement, relations, and linking it to conscience, reason, and universal science. Locke's man or person is not a human, but a posthuman. He claimed for the first time that consciousness was human identity's defining feature. Human bodies not only changed much over time, but they were different one from another as to have tails or pig faces. He claimed species were conventions as there were not fixed boundaries. A human, a corporeal rational being, in opposition to angels, incorporeal rational beings, could be recognized through its performance of rationality, words and actions. Thus, humans could be recognized by their sensorial and perceptual uses, forming abstractions and communicating them. Communication was based on social conventions, but these performances of rationality were supposed to be universal, limiting them to recognizable social performances depending on the state of development of man's society. Human information was derived either from revelation or from matter senses. But Locke conceived there might be other species of intellectual beings with other perceptual faculties, reaching deeper into the imperceptible constitutions of things to humans, and eventually humans might learn from them. Shall we rejoice? First, Locke's definitions were built from several assumptions and were all grounded in theology. Manhood had to improve the earth for the divine commandment, and for this, humans had reason, measurable through words and actions, movements, gestures, and science. Second, man was a self-possessing thing in expansion to guarantee a social order and a status of elites. Conscience and reason were precise for legal and dominative purposes, property, and both involved specific social performances, propriety. Once these patterns to define humans and posthuman are hegemonic, what remains left for a different way of living, feeling, or moving? Thank you.